Israel-Iran war, 12 days of Israel-Iran war. Since yesterday morning, there is a ceasefire in effect. As you could see, the title of this briefing is a little bit different from the one that I did a couple of days ago when we're kind of like we're in the midst of this war. Now we're kind of like hopefully post-war, at least for now. And so I wanted to talk about the aspect of looking beyond the horizon. However, as you probably may know me or some of you by now, I always like to contextualize and to make things build one layer upon another so we will all be on the same page. So as always, I would like to start with some general framing and how we get here, and then to talk about Israel's operational blueprint. Then we'll talk about the war in the Arab world, which, as Rabbi Lori mentioned earlier, this is one of the major things that we are trying to convey in our professional work. And then concluding with some notes regarding the current situation and looking ahead. My briefing, or the starting of this briefing, is 1979 in Iran. Islamic coup in Iran. Iran becomes a Shiite theocracy under the leadership of the Shiite mullah regime. Those of you who attended my sessions, either in person or in Zoom, heard me many times talking about this regime that came to power in 1979. For those of you who have not heard me on that issue, very shortly I will explain. Shiite are a minority in Islam. They are about 14–15%. And the Shiites, or the major branch of the Shiites, known as the 12-ish branch, argue that leading the Muslim world should be done by a male descendant of the fourth Muslim caliph that was assassinated in the 7th century. Islam emerged on the stage of history in the 7th century. The 12-ish branch Shiite, which is the central Shiite denomination camp, defined those 12 leaders following this Ali as imams. And they argue that the imam is not only a spiritual and political leader, but actually is a person that is connected to a divine source of knowledge, and therefore his rule has to be blindly obeyed. As part of the Shiite denomination beliefs and narratives, one major thing is the concept of establishing a global Islamic entity, according, of course, to the Shiite denomination. And this is an entity rather known in the Shiite terminology as the imamate, actually named after this term imam that I have just shortly ago explained. And obviously, according to that outlook, people should live their life according to the Islamic Shiite denomination in a global entity called the imamate. When this regime came to power in 1979, the mullah regime, incentivized and inspired to its core by this vision of imamate, this regime, radical regime, revolutionary regime, actually translated that vision into a blueprint of its geostrategic expansion across the region under the title of exporting the Islamic Revolution, envisioning creating of what is known by the name of the Shiite or the Iranian crescent, namely a crescent of influence, massively ruled, influenced either directly or in remote control by the Shiite regime in Iran. And that sphere, this crescent that you see, its shape in front of you actually is stretching all the way from the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, starting in Gaza Strip and crossing through Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Bahrain, Yemen, and then continuing to Africa. That sphere of influence, this Shiite crescent, is, according to that blueprint, is a milestone towards the ultimate vision of establishing the Shiite imamate. In the last couple of decades, and I would add, unfortunately, the mullah regime was quite successful in enhancing that vision. And to that end, the mullah regime has developed and applied a very sophisticated mechanism, a triangle of deterrence that has three components. One is the nuclear program, the other one is the regime's missiles and drones project, and the third component is the proxy, the militias, a network of armies of terror across the Middle East that are massively armed and supported and guided, instructed by the mullah regime, to name a few: Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Iraqi Shiite militias, Houthis in Yemen, and others. This mechanism, this triangle, has been acting or serving two major purposes. One, each and every one component of this triangle, if you want to describe it as a stool, each leg of that stool actually is sheltering the other two components. In other words, we are looking at a mechanism that is supposed to provide a deterrence. And the other objective of that mechanism in the context of deterrence is that in the end of the day, this mechanism, the three components all combined, supposed to provide the mullah regime in Tehran with an ultimate immunity, meaning they serve as an ultimate card of deterrence to deter any attempt to challenge, to attack the mullah regime. That mechanism was enormously effective in the service of the mullah regime. And throughout the last couple of decades, the mullah regime, by activating that mechanism, was indeed able to build itself almost a total immunity. Its aggression across the Middle East that resulted in an enormous death and destruction, charging the life of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, making millions refugees, turning states and cities into dust. All those things that have been taking place under this blueprint of the mullah regime expansion program, the mullah regime remained totally immune from any repercussions. And so by spreading this death and destruction, the mullah regime was making a significant strides towards achieving its goal of achieving and establishing this Shiite crescent. However, a significant event, October 7 attack of Hamas, one of the mullah's regime-backed militias, actually is going to result in an interesting and dramatic shift in this whole structure. The attack of Hamas on Israel on October 7 actually ignited the war between Israel and Hamas, Israel and Islamic Jihad, Israel and Hezbollah, and also frictions between Israel and Iraqi Shiite militias and Houthis in Yemen. During 2024, what happened was that as an outcome of that war, the mullah regime lost two significant arms. The Hezbollah was defeated in the war with Israel. The Hezbollah was the most significant proxy of the mullah regime. Hamas and Islamic Jihad basically have been severely beaten in Gaza Strip. Hamas has lost its control over Gaza Strip, and it's under Israeli mounting military pressure. And so what happened in 2024 was that not only the mullah regime has lost, or substantially two of its major branches have been damaged, but also the mullah regime, for the first time ever since 1980s, when the mullah regime was engaged in a war with Iraq, a war that lasted for 8 years. In 2024, for the first time since that war, the mullah regime basically experienced a massive Israeli attack on its territory that actually exposed the vulnerability of that regime. This process that happened during 2024 resulted in a domino effect that, accumulatively sort of speaking, resulted in the erosion of the deterrence capacities and image of the mullah regime that the regime has been building so sophisticatedly and effectively during the last couple of decades. That process that I've just described right now, meaning October 7 attack, the damage to the major branches of the mullah regime, the downfall of Assad regime in Syria as an outcome of a domino effect to the impact of October 7, and the fact that the Mullah regime sustained for the first time after many years damage directly because of its aggression, all those components resulted in a significant, unique window of opportunity from a strategic and operational perspective. That has been a moment where the Mullah regime has been significantly weakened, and adding to that, the growing challenges in Iran, economically, socially, environmentally, all those components together resulted in a strategic window of opportunity, an operational window of opportunity, and that explains the fact why Israel, the government of Israel, decided to launch that war to remove the threat of the Iranian nuclear and missile projects. So as you may all remember, the very early phase of this war started with an Israeli massive strike inside Iran. That massive strike had an interesting multi-layer, many moving parts that have been synchronized in an amazing way to basically achieve the ultimate potential or manifest the ultimate potential of such attack. And there has been some inner logic to this Israeli blueprint of the attack that was carried out in the night between June 12th and June 13th. First, Israel targeted the leadership, the military leadership of the two major military establishments of the regime. One is the Iranian army and the other one, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. That strike took out the whole rank of the senior leadership of both military establishments. Parallel to that, Israel aimed another significant human target, and these are Iranian scientists that has been operating in what used to be known by the name of the Armament Group. This is an elite club of scientists that their mission was and is to translate nuclear capacities into weaponizing that into a nuclear weapon. So the first thing that Israel is doing during that night is to take out, to eliminate those people. And by doing that, Israel has been significantly, immediately, first crippled the chain of command of the Iranian power, and second, took out from the equation internally the most significant people, the scientists that are crucial for the Iranian nuclear military project. The second component parallel to that was an Israeli pinpoint attack on two Iranian nuclear sites. One is in Natanz and the other one in Isfahan. The nuclear site in Natanz basically was in charge of the enriching of the uranium. The one in Isfahan actually provided another significant link in the chain of towards owning a nuclear military capacity, and this is by transforming the liquid form of the uranium into a solid one. This is a very crucial point or phase towards the producing of a nuclear military bomb. Parallel to that, at the same time, Israel starts to attack the Iranian ballistic and drone infrastructure across Iran. That map that you see in front of you illustrates in the very early hours of the Israeli attack between the 12th and the 13th, how Israel has been simultaneously, while attacking the nuclear sites, also attacking the Iranian missiles, ballistic missiles, and drone infrastructure. It has been estimated prior to the war that Iran has something like 3,000 ballistic missiles or so, and thousands of attacking drones. Israel started immediately attacking the infrastructure because it was very clear that that will be the main way that the Mullah regime is going to retaliate. This is the main spine of its military power, to attack Israel. In the context of the ballistic missiles, there are two major components. One is the launchers, and the other thing is the fueling of the missiles. Launchers are the crucial component. Without launchers, the missiles are worthless. It is estimated that the Mullah regime prior to the war had hundreds of launchers, and the issue of the fueling is also significant. There are two, roughly speaking, ways to launch those missiles, the ballistic missiles. One is through fueling a liquid fuel, and the other one through a solid fuel. The process of liquid fuel is long and complicated. It takes about an hour, and during that period of time, the missile and the launcher are exposed. The process of solid fueling is shorter, and it takes place many times beneath the surface. And so in that process, the missiles and the launchers are relatively less exposed. One way or another, Israel is attacking that infrastructure, and not less significant, Israel is actually taking out the Iranian anti-aerial sort of surface-to-air defense capacities, meaning the anti-aerial missiles and radars in different parts of Iran. The outcome of this process is that within 48 hours, Israeli Air Force commander basically announced that Israel has established a controlled aerial corridor. In other words, the Israeli Air Force now control the sky of Iran, and mostly particularly talking about the western and central part of Iran. Notice Iran is a huge state in terms of land, and so the eastern part of Iran was yet out of reach of the Israeli jets at this point. And indeed, in the very first days of the war, most of the launching from Iran was taking place from west part of Iran, and then the more Israel has been decapitating the capacities, the launching were more and more starting from the eastern part of Iran, but Israel also was able to reach some of those points. Right in front of you, you see that the major areas of this ballistic depot, sort of speaking, talking about the underground depots, the places where the launchers were either under the ground or surface, where Israel was focusing its attention in the first couple of days to take out as much as possible both the missiles and the launchers. It is estimated that by the end of the war, Israel basically took out about 50 or 60% of the launchers, and it is estimated that the Iranian regime has left with, roughly speaking, some 1,000 ballistic missiles in its possession. Obviously, another significant development that happens, as we all know, is that the United States of America at some point intervene. United States is attacking both Natanz and Isfahan nuclear sites and is attacking particularly the Fordo fuel enrichment plant. As of now, as you may know, there are different reports, some of them conflicting regarding the outcome of the United States strike on the Fordo nuclear site. While it's quite clear that Natanz and Isfahan nuclear sites have been very significantly, if not totally, obliterated, the fate of the Fordo site is not clear. This is a site that has been built deep beneath a mountain, going deep hundreds of feet, sheltered by this mountain, and of course, in addition to that, layers of concrete. That site considered to be enormously immune. Indeed, the United States used the massive bombs in its possession to try and to demolish this site, the Fordo site. As of now, conflicting reports. United States President Trump firmly announced that the site has been destroyed. There are other reports that argue differently. It's not so clear what exactly is the outcome of the attack on this site. The most recent announcement that came just shortly ago by the Israeli head of Mossad, which is kind of like very untypical, I would say, could indicate that indeed there has been a very significant damage caused. The Iranians themselves said that their nuclear sites have been significantly damaged. I don't know to say to what extent we can rely on the Iranian announcement. I would say cautiously that we could deduct that indeed there has been a significant damage, all in all, to the Iranian nuclear facilities. Some more, some less, but the reports that are coming in actually indicates or suggests that indeed there has been a cumulative significant damage caused to those sites. Another interesting aspect that I would like to explore is the issue of the Arab world and the war. As I mentioned before in the beginning of my briefing, and I was talking about the Iranian expansion program, this Shiite crescent or Iranian crescent, you notice that it was mostly at the expense of the Arab world, particularly the Levant states, namely Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, also Gaza Strip, and the Arab Gulf states, the monarchies, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. They all sustain the damages that the Mullah regime has inflicted. The Arab world clearly understood and recognized the danger that the Mullah regime presents to the Arab world. Syria was, literally speaking, occupied by Iran until the downfall of Assad regime. Lebanon has been kidnapped in a remote control by the Iranian proxy, the Hezbollah. Iraq became under a significant Iranian influence. Houthis in Yemen became a very significant arm of the Iranian regime. Though the Houthis in Yemen are not necessarily just a classic proxy, they definitely enabled Iran a foothold in one of these most strategic locations in this planet, in Yemen. In Gaza Strip, the Iranian regime was able to gain control and influence through its support to Hamas and Islamic Jihad. In all these areas, actually, the bottom line was an increasing death, destruction, demolition, hundreds of thousands of people killed, millions became refugees. And so the Arab world was recognizing the Iranian threat, yet too poor, too weak, too disintegrated. The Arab world was unable to actually confront the Iranian expansion. To a large extent, de facto, the Arab world came to terms with the Iranian growing dominance and influence across the region. When you look at the reaction in the Arab world, on one level, the governments in the Arab world across the board rushed to to condemn Israel for the attack. They rushed to express desire for stability. They expressed solidarity with Iran under the title of respecting the sovereignty of Iran, something that the Iranian regime clearly did not do when it comes to the sovereignty of an Arab state. That public opinion or that public statements of Arab government should not be surprised because, as I said before, they are all aware of the fact that their neighbor, Iran, could cause them a significant damage. They want to play it nice. However, there are the levels of the public discussion. And in the public discussion, as it's being reflected in cartoons across the Arab world, you could see different perspectives or different aspects or elements of this discussion. On the right-hand side, you see the Star of David. This is a cartoon done by an Egyptian artist who basically reflects one sentiment in the Arab world, and that is the sentiment that is satisfied with the damage that the Iranian ballistic missiles caused Israel, resulting in the killing of 29 Israeli civilians, injured of hundreds, significant damage and destruction. And so there are those in the Arab world who celebrate it. There are those who are actually taking that to the point to expressing some sort of like wishful thinking that that is the beginning of what is known in those circles as the Zionist entity that should come to an end. So when you see this cartoon on the right-hand side, which also have a very strong anti-Jewish propaganda, that cartoon expressed those in the Arab world that are satisfied with the damage that the Iranian ballistic missiles caused Israel. That, of course, also has to be understood in the context of the war in Gaza, that, as you could understand, fuel a lot of anger and resentment and further hatred towards Israel in different parts of the Arab world.
Avi, I'm sorry to interrupt, but if anyone's screen is too small, you might not be able to see that there are little rats running around inside the Star of David. So you can just see the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism connection there. I just wanted to point that out.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. In the center, you see something that I think is very significant and very representative of the discussion in the Arab world vis-a-vis the war. You see these two figures in the front. Obviously, you see that they are representing Arabs. One screams support Iran, and one screams support Israel. And you see, of course, in the background, Israel and Iran are in a standoff. That cartoon actually, I think, to a large extent, expressed quite accurately the mindset in the Arab world. Because on the one hand, there is this animosity to Israel, as we saw in the previous cartoon. But on the other hand, there is this enormous animosity to the Mullah regime in Tehran that inflicted an enormous death and destruction upon Arab nations. I can tell you that in Syria, for example, people were celebrating the defeat of the Iranians in the war with Israel, because obviously you can understand Syrian people pay dearly for the Iranian hegemonic vision and expansion. So that cartoon clearly reflects those different perspectives in the Arab world, this dichotomy, sort of speaking. You either support Iran or you either support Israel, and there is a lot of backlash, sort of speaking, between the sides. And then to the left-hand side, you see this jet, Israeli jet, of course, flying over the Middle East, and you could see the sign or the symbol of nuclear capacities. And this is something that is also very significant, because reading many and hearing many Arab commentators and analysts talking about this war and the ramifications of the war, obviously across the board, I would say one of the strongest expression is the expression of awe and shock in the Arab world as they look at the way that war was conducted and the outcome of that. We should remember, as I said before, that the Mullah regime has been building itself almost an untouchable image, almost a total immunity. Nobody in the region really wanted to deal with that regime because the regime could be very harmful, using its proxies, as it happened with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Gaza, and so on and so on. In addition to that, the regime constantly marketed as an image of undefeatable, a mighty power, through an endless parades, military parades. Every other day there was a new announcement in Iran that they have made a new missile and a new submarine, and they do that and they do that. In other words, the image of Iran was such an image that it was viewed as a real tiger you don't want to mess up with. Here comes the war with Israel, and the Mullah regime is humiliatingly defeated. I mean, the Israeli infiltration, to the point Israeli intelligence knew exactly where the leaders of this regime were sleeping and taking them out in their beds. The fact that the Israeli Air Force actually took control over the Iranian sky and basically were kind of like strolling back and forth from Israel to Iran undisturbedly. These are all things that if you would ask someone in the region not so long ago if this is a scenario that is possible, the answer would be, of course, no. This is totally non-conceivable. This is totally inconceivable. clearly, I would say that from the Mullah regime perspective, they have never expected, even in the worst nightmares, such a situation. So that explains the shock and awe across the Arab world as they look in the outcome of this war. And the interesting thing is that when Arab commentators are trying to look ahead, it's quite clear that across the board, they are reflecting an opinion or notion that basically said, well, there is a big superpower in the region. That superpower is the state of Israel, the Israeli Air Force, and notice this nuclear sign, nuclear symbol, that actually symbolizes that if there is an umbrella, a nuclear umbrella that is over the region, this is an Israeli nuclear umbrella. In other words, what we see here is a reflection of an opinion or a narrative that actually says the outcome of this war is that there is a real big superpower in the Middle East. It's called Israel. And that brings us, of course, to the question, okay, so what can we expect? What could take place if I would try to take ourselves a little bit beyond the horizon? One big question that constantly is out there is the question, will the war result in the downfall of the Mullah regime? In that regard, there are different perspectives. There is one perspective that argues that because of the war, the Iranian people, though most of whom clearly don't like this regime, they will come around the regime because it's issues of national pride and so on and so on. However, there is another perspective that argues that it's very possible that we will witness an aftershock waves once this war is done and over with. We will start witnessing an aftershock wave that presents an increasing challenge to the endurance of that regime. A major aftershock wave has to do with the issue of the successor of the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei. Khamenei is the late 80s, he's sick, and there has been a long period of time reports about already brewing power struggle within the power centers of this regime regarding the question of the successor. It's very possible that following the war, that power struggle is going to intensify. Another significant aftershock has to do with the humiliating defeat of Iran in this war. Though the Mullah regime right now, as you could expect, is kind of like trying to convey propaganda of victory, nobody buys that, obviously. It's very clear that that has been a very agonizing defeat, humiliating defeat for the Mullah's regime. The level of the infiltration of Israel so deeply into all level of command and knowledge centers and military centers is just shocking to the point everyone suspects in everyone. And so, of course, this is a situation that further fuels tensions within the regime itself. To that, we have to add the accumulating inner challenges in Iran, economically, socially, environmentally. And remember, we are looking at a nation of like 90 million people, and that nation is struggling enormously in every possible perspective since that regime took power in the late 1970s. So we have witnessed in the past couple of waves of protest and demonstrations and uprising of the Iranian people that were brutally oppressed by the regime. Is it going to be different this time? Are we going to see reignition of this popular uprising, the demonstrations, the riots? Will this time be different from the previous one? In other words, will an ignition or reignition of that flame of uprising will not be put out this time by the Mullah regime? In other words, there are different components that when you look today, basically you could say they give a good background for the assumption that that regime may come across significant challenges. And in such an environment with all these components that I mentioned, we are looking at potentially a dynamic that no one could expect and predict exactly where is it going to end and what is it going to lead to. I would just remind us all that we have in the history episodes where regimes that seems to be very powerful actually collapsed in a very short, swift dynamic. Like, for example, we all remember the downfall of the Berlin Wall and following the rapid collapse of the Soviet Union. So it's, of course, a big question whether this regime is going to collapse or it's going to endure. That will have a lot of ramifications, as we all understand. And then there is another significant question. We are in a very significant pivotal moment. This is a very dramatic moment. I would say to a large extent, it marks the end, to a large extent, of the Iranian hegemonic vision, which for itself is a good news. It actually offers a window of opportunity, maybe a path towards stabilization. But first, we must be clear in one thing. There is one big condition that is crucial for the potential materialization of this trajectory of stabilization, and that has to do with the story of what's going to be the agreement, assuming there is going to be an agreement between Western powers and the United States on the one hand, and the Mullah regime on the other hand. And in order to try and to materialize the potential of this window of opportunity for stabilization, such an agreement must be one that, in the end of the day, will make sure that the Mullah regime will not be able to resume or to pursue a nuclear military capacity. Such an agreement has, to a large extent possible, restrict the Iranian regime ballistic missiles. And such an agreement must have a very powerful, rigorous enforcement mechanism that will be applied immediately without any concessions once there is any attempt of the Mullah regime to violate the agreement, because the underlying assumption is that the Mullah regime will try to start over. And so this is something that has to be clear when we are talking about the potential to materialize the path or the window of opportunity leading, hopefully, towards stabilization. If that is the case, and we are trying to look beyond the horizon, what could be these features of these stabilizations? What could be the representation of that potential stabilization? One thing I say is the strengthening of a lines of stability, boosting normalization, and particularly, of course, talking in the context of the Israeli-Saudi relationship. We are looking at a frame that includes major Arab states, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and so on, that basically are the significant players. They have an interest, obviously, in stability, and already some of them are already having relationship with Israel. Egypt has a peace with Israel. United Arab Emirates has peace with Israel. So one manifestation of that path towards stabilization could be the strengthening of that alliance, which is, of course, a good news. Other aspect is that with the collapse of the Iranian hegemonic vision master plan, we could expect the weakening of semi-state actors. Those semi-state actors, particularly the one backed by Iran, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Iraqi Shiite militias. The weakening of those semi-state factors is a good news because it could potentially enable Arab states like Iraq, like Lebanon, Syria, maybe to a certain extent also even Yemen, to try and to restore sovereignty. That path, that process is now coinciding with an increasing internalization in the Arab discussion, that the situation where you got a state within a state, like in the case of Hezbollah in Lebanon, like in the case of the Iraqi Shiite militias, that situation is a recipe for a disaster. And one of the major things to address that challenge is to stress the concept that says that the only factor in a sovereign government state to hold weapon is the state itself, not anybody else, not political parties, not semi-state factors. In other words, the conjunction of these two things could result in restoring and strengthening of sovereignty of states, which for itself, once again, is a good thing. It is possible that once that stability is further established on the ground, and states are restoring their sovereignty, and they are not subjecting their agenda to an external semi-state factors, one of the potential ramifications of that, for example, in the context of Israel and its neighboring countries, is that we could see a process of negotiations, discussions between Israel and Lebanon, Israel and Syria, that will diffuse controversies between the states, and that will be a layer that could lead potentially to a next level of discussions between those states regarding future arrangements and diplomatic relationship. One more significant potential outcome in this post-horizons or beyond horizon era is that all these things will enable a much more proactive involvement of major Arab states in positively shaping the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. When you look at the position of those players in the last couple of decades, when the mullah's regime expansion blueprint was dominant, you will find out that their role of those Arab states was very minimal. And rightly so, because they realized that it was the Iranian regime and its semi-state proxies who were dictating the course of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they were fueling the flames of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Under those circumstances, there was little chance for proactively involvement of Arab major states that could try and to shape a positive trajectory of the conflict. Now, with the collapse of the mullah's regime hegemonic vision, with the weakening of its proxies, the semi-state actors, with the increasing chance for more power and influence of the alliance of stability, one of the things that could be is that it will positively radiate on the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, in other words, going back to what I say, if the agreement that expected to take place between the West and Iran will be such that will prevent the reignition of the Iranian hegemonic vision, namely through its nuclear project, through its missiles project, if that's going to be the case, and such an agreement will have the mechanism to make sure that that will be the case, then I think that we could look more positively in a scenario where we will have a window of opportunity that is being materialized in the day beyond the horizon. Obviously, this is a scenario that we hope will materialize. As of now, it is possible, it's not definite. It's very much connected in the end of the day and dependent upon the outcome of the negotiations and the agreement between the Western powers and Iran, and the persistence and determination of Western powers to make sure that the mullah's regime hegemonic vision will be part of the past and not the present, and not the future. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, I'm concluding my presentation and opening this session to your questions.
Thank you so much, Avi. I think we could probably take the screen share off, Didier, so that I can highlight people as they, great. Thank you so much. Fascinating and so helpful. I will take rabbinic privilege to ask sort of the first question. And then I think I know who is here from PJCC. So I'd love to try to alternate Marin JCC people and PJCC people for questions. But can you explain to everybody a little about the Begin doctrine and how you see this idea of first taking our enemies seriously and sort of starting from strength, playing into this factor. And with that, where do you see the situation in Gaza, the war in Gaza, our hostages, the work that's being done to close up tunnels, et cetera? Where does that fit in? I think there's a narrative that this is a distraction from those pieces, but we've talked so many times over the years about sort of the head of the octopus, right? And that we've kind of finally gone to that, and the tentacles all over the crescent, and one particular tentacle in Gaza is still being sort of active. So how are we to think about that relationship of what's happening now, and really the idea of what does it mean to be proactive versus reactive as an Israeli strategy overall?
Well, I'll start with the component of what you say, the Begin doctrine. Begin doctrine, Menachem Begin, the previous Israeli prime minister, you may all remember that he was the one that ordered the elimination of the Iraqi nuclear reactor back in 1981. The Israeli Air Force attacked that reactor and ruined it. Begin's doctrine basically said, if we identify a threat that could be an existential threat to the state of Israel, we have to preemptively take it out. It's interesting because before Begin, major doctrine, which also kind of like, I think, reflects the level of the threats, the Ben-Gurion doctrine basically said Israel has to act swiftly to move the war to the enemy's territory and to try to make it as short as possible, not to endure it for a long period of time, and to win the war decisively. So these are two different perspectives. If we are going along the line of the strategic security policy of Israel, I would say we can definitely mark the watershed, and this is, of course, October 7. Until October 7, Israeli security strategy was kind of like contemplating between different ends, I would even say multipolar, sort of speaking, perspectives. There was an inner debate and even confusion between the issue of like, when do you take preemptive strike? In what circumstances can you evaluate the cost and the benefits against the losses and so on and so. So there was some sort of like confusion that was legitimately understood given the circumstances, that basically resulted in an Israeli geostrategic security policy that was quite non-decisive. I would even say a little bit vague. The best way to illustrate it is to quote a statement by one of the previous Israeli chief of staff, Gadi Eisenkot. Everybody agrees he was a great chief of staff. And he said the following sentence, and he said, you don't start a war over a rocket. In other words, what he basically said, referring back to the time before October 7, when Israel sustained the challenges of rockets coming from Gaza or from Lebanon and so on, the Israeli overarching policy was we contain, we can live with that, we are not going to launch a war over that. That has changed following October 7. In other words, if there was a space of we can live with that, we can tolerate that, I would say that today the perspective is zero tolerance. You shoot first and then you contemplate. And you could see that happening in Lebanon. You could see that happening in Syria. Israel is constantly preemptively strike those places. And in that regard, obviously, the war in Iran, with Iran, that was a clear manifestation of that change that basically says we are done contemplating about the cost and benefits. We are acting decisively, preemptively to remove challenge. As for Gaza Strip, I have said since the beginning of the war, and I hope that I'm right, that I think that could result in a dynamic that could lead to a breakthrough in the context of the issue of Gaza Strip. Going back to what I've said in my many briefings all along, you may remember, Hamas is not going to disappear. I mean, all this rhetoric about eliminating Hamas, it's totally irrelevant. The issue in the end of the day is not about elimination of Hamas. It's about, in the end of the day, to create a situation where the Hamas ability to continue and to dictate its radical agenda, as it was unfortunately doing, that ability will be, to a large extent, neutralized. And I think that right now it's very clear that following the war with Iran and the defeat of Iran, that comes together with the already significant damage that Hamas sustained, we are definitely looking to then situation when Hamas' ability to continue and to dictate, that ability has been significantly erased. Significantly erased. Hamas is not going to disappear. But the issue here is to create those conditions and circumstances where Hamas' ability to continue to dictate, that ability will be degraded as much as possible. That leads me to the place where, in the end of the day, the ball is at the Israeli court. In other words, the Israeli government. Will the Israeli government, if Israel government will be guided by this mindset that I was now presenting of degrading Hamas' ability to dictate and not sticking to rhetoric that is irrelevant, that could potentially result in a situation where we could seriously talk about ending this situation in Gaza, meaning releasing all the hostages, bringing them back, those who are dead, to bury them properly, and those who are alive to bring them back to their families, but also not less significant in the end of the day to offer a way out for the people in Gaza. This is a brutal war that is going on in Gaza Strip. Many innocent people paid with their life and suffered. And so I would say that this is my hope, that that will be a moment right now that because of the war and the outcome of the war, there will be a bold move by the Israeli government to end this situation in Gaza Strip. There is some sort of like a frame that could be applied in the context of the involvement of Arab states. And going back to what I said before about hopefully once this Iranian regime tentacles are significantly cut, there is a much larger space for proactively involvement of players who want stability. That is definitely a good circumstances to move in the direction of ending the situation in Gaza Strip. And I hope that that will be the case. Today, President Trump made a strong statement, basically expressing a great optimism regarding a very soon deal in Gaza Strip. I can only hope that first it's correct, and second, that it basically would result in the end of the war, bringing back the hostages, and starting the process of both rebuilding, rehabilitating Israeli society, but also rehabilitating Gaza Strip and the people of Gaza Strip.
Thank you so much, Avi. That was very, very helpful. So if you'd like to ask a question, you need to do two things. One is turn on your screen, and two is do the raise hand. That way you'll come to the top of the line on my screen. And I also want to appreciate both Judy Wolf-Bolton and Jordan Shanker, our CEOs of PJCC and Osher Marin JCC, for being on. That's a testament to your wisdom, Avi. And we have a room of staff in conference room A. I see you there. So go ahead and put up your hands, and I'll just ask if someone asks your question, take your hand down so we can be efficient with our conversation. I see the first person. I'm going to ask to unmute, and I'm going to add your spotlight. But you'll have to unmute. There you go.
Okay. Avi, how do you think that the Iranian problem was generated in part by what happened with what England and America did by overthrowing the first duly elected Iranian minister, and then the mullahs realized they didn't have a home as soon as the Shah took over, and they went to England. And when the mullahs came back, they were pissed. And their ability, without any power, because they are Shiite, not Sunni, they were basically surrounded. And so they found little proxy groups and put their money into them. And that's how I see this thing spun out of control completely.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, there are different components that you bring to the table. I guess there is a need for some more clarity. I'll start with that. In 1979, then Iran was ruled by a monarchy. That monarchy was clearly not popular among many of the people in Iran. And actually what happened was that there was an uprising of the people in Iran. That uprising was not launched by the Shiite clerics. That is an uprising that was launched by unions, socialist affiliated organizations, the white public. To a large extent, what happened in Iran in 79 was this uprising that actually reflected a lot of resentment and anger and criticism over a very corrupted monarchy. Basically, that uprising was hijacked by the mullah regime. You may remember Ayatollah Khomeini, he lived in France, actually. And he was basically flooding Iran with cassettes, recorded cassettes, preaching and so on and so on. And so what happened was that for different reasons, the mullah regime was able to hijack, sort of speaking, this uprising in Iran and to take power. Now, the mullah regime, as I mentioned before, it's a radical regime, and it draws its early roots from early days of Islam, the 7th century. We talked about the power struggle between Sunnis and Shiites back then in the 7th century. I talked about the concept of imamate and imam. This is a regime that its revolutionary and radical ideology is actually rooted in a very ancient narratives. The issue of contemporary history as far as this regime is less relevant. So this regime, for example, was positioning itself as the defender of all the oppressed people. This is something that actually is deeply rooted in the Shiite denomination, in the Shiite narratives, because it goes all the way back to sense of martyrdom and being deprived and being discriminated against, that are very powerful in the Shiite narratives. So all in all, I would say, looking at that, I will not necessarily associate it with the UK policy or the American policy during, I would say, the second part of the 20th century. I think it's more accurate to look at this regime, in the end of the day, in the context or the lenses of the ideological and historical and emotional narratives that are very much guiding that regime, its outlook, its policy, and its behavior. So I think that would be the right way to put it.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Cindy on. And let's try to ask you to unmute.
Okay, when the previous gentleman was asking the question, I thought he was referring to Mossadegh. And I was wondering how your answer would differ from.
Mossadegh is something that happens more than 50 years ago. Again, this is something that I think will be a little bit artificial if we try to connect all the way from Mossadegh to the developments in our times. I understood that he was referring to Mossadegh. Again, I mean, as an example, there is an episode going back 50 years or more, actually 70 years. There was even not many people know that, but there was a short episode also that there was an independent Kurdish state that was established in Iran for a year. But again, I wouldn't necessarily connect those specific events with the big story of the Mullah regime in Iran. I think connecting that through that lenses will leave out the most significant components that are necessary to understand what drives that regime, what does it stand for, why does it stand for what it stands. All of those things are, as I said before, are less about these contemporary episodes, but they are going back to a wider and deeper and ancient perspectives.
Michael.
Thanks, Rabbi. Avi, I'm curious how the situation has changed in the Middle East related to how the street in different countries relates to its leadership. I think the leadership in most Arab countries that I've thought of have always put Israel in a box of being either the devil or our clear opponent. And that's part of how those regimes have been able to maintain their strength over their people, is that we're keeping you safe from Israel. And we'll eventually support the cause of the Palestinians in their just and upright approach to creating their own country. And maybe even, I don't know, the Iranians said, get rid of the Israelis, get rid of the Jews. The rest of the Arab world has at least has been opposed or has been supporting a Palestinian state independent of whether or not Israel exists. How do you think the current situation changes any of that perspective of the people in those countries like Iraq, like Jordan, like Lebanon, Syria, to maybe change the nature of the relationship between Israel and those countries? Thanks.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much. That's a great question. It's a great question because to answer that, we need time, we need perspectives to see what's going to be the public realm following that in the context of how they view Israel. But I think it's a great question because this is definitely one of the kind of questions that when you want to understand where and why and how things are evolving and when they are going, this is kind of those questions that you have to follow constantly for a long period of time. I would say something, there is a big irony with this whole thing. As I said before, when I was talking about reactions in the Arab world, one of the interesting phenomena is that while the Arab world has been paying dearly for the Iranian expansion, and the Arab knows that, and they say that all those years, at the same time, the Arab world continued to, as you say, box Israel in this box that is called, this is the enemy. This is our biggest source of threat. Iran occupied Syria. Hundreds of thousands of Syrians killed. The Arab world knows that, and they curse the Iranians. Iran took control over Lebanon. The same story. The Arab world knows that, and they curse the Iranians, and so on and so on and so on. In Gaza Strip, the Arab world, including Palestinians, says Iran basically took the Palestinians, sacrificed the Palestinians. We know that, the Arab world says. We know that. We know all those things. Yet, as I said before, the Arab world, too weak, too afraid, too petrified, too paralyzed, basically came to terms with the Iranian control. as a fact, the Arab League took back to its ranks Bashar al-Assad, the previous president of Syria. Believe me, for many years they cursed him. They said never, ever, ever, ever. They took him back. While it was very clear that he is an Iranian proxy, that he is basically playing to the fluid of the Iranian regime, that he was responsible for this enormous massacre of hundreds of thousands of Syrians. The Arab world took him in. So the Arab world basically turned to the safe corner of the rhetoric. Strong rhetoric, and as part of this strong rhetoric, condemning Israel. Israel is the enemy. More than that, the Iranian regime was able, one of the major mechanisms that the Iranian regime was able to entrench itself deep in the Arab world was because the Iranian regime was very skillfully and sophisticatedly playing the slogans of the resistance, meaning we are going to liberate Palestine and we are building these armies of resistance. They will liberate Palestine. The Arab world was applauding, and they were basically, oh, now they are going to liberate Palestine. What happened meanwhile was that these armies of resistance occupied Syria and occupied Lebanon and occupied Gaza Strip and occupied Iraq and occupied Yemen. And the Arab world realized that. It's not that they didn't realize that. They did realize it. I can show you an endless, over course of time, endless articles and analysis of Arab commentators who says, look, this is what's going on. We are being occupied by the Iranians under the slogan of the resistance, curse upon the Iranians. And then they went back to the very safe place of Israel is the major threat to the Arab world. This is part of this very convoluted mindset. And to conclude, the irony, this bitter irony, I would say, here is something that should not be ignored for the records of history. While vilified in the Arab world as the enemy and the source of threat, it is Israel that sacrificed soldiers and civilians and sustained an enormous damage. It is in the end of the day Israel that actually offered the Arab states the opportunity to get free of the Iranian suffocating grip. The Arab world, Lebanon, is gaining its potential freedom because Israeli soldiers died in the war against Hezbollah, and Israeli communities were ruined because of the missiles of the Hezbollah. Palestinians in Gaza Strip that basically have become hostages by Hamas, their own leader, now maybe could gain their freedom after the devastating price that Israel is paying. So here is a big irony. You know, Israel, the one that has been cursed and loathed, is the one in the end of the day that offering the Arab world to get free of this Iranian grip.
I think this is a good pausing place. I'm sorry, Deborah, it's 10:45, so we're going to say goodbye for now. I want to bring my friend and colleague, Rabbi Allison Solomon, our partner from PJCC and Osher Marin JCC to make this happen, just to give a word of thanks to you, Avi, at the end here.
Thank you.
Avi, I just texted Lori, I love you more and more each briefing. You really just move me deeply, both in your knowledge and especially in this briefing, your capacity to navigate the emotional landscape as well, you know, the real lived reality of people on the ground and the nuances of what this is doing to everyday people in the crossfires. So just thank you so much for your knowledge and your skills and your depth and compassion.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Oh, we're so grateful. Thank you, everybody, for being on with us. And I know Rabbi Lori has, you know, tremendous offerings at the Peninsula JCC. If you're ever in Marin, you're always welcome with us. And we all have newsletters and events. And Avi's briefings are both, I think, up on all of our sites, including his own. So just thank you all so much for tuning in to stay open and curious of this very complicated situation. We're sending blessings for peace for all.
Amen.
Avi, would you want to give one last sentence of reflection on where you are and how you hope to spend the next few days, or a vision for what's next?
Well, as you know, we had a couple of challenging days here, running to shelters and in between. Our cat, by the way, was totally oblivion. She couldn't care less. And but it was interesting, you see people. It's interesting, this is a situation. The shelter, we don't have shelter in our home, but we have a shelter just across the street. And so every time there was a siren, people go in, and you see people that are coming with their pets, and some people that you see on the sidewalk, you don't even, and all of a sudden people get to know one the other. It is of course times that, particularly in a small community like ours, you could see that it brings the good of people in many different perspectives. So obviously, we are constantly in our work trying to decode what is going on, trying to convey as much as possible knowledge and understanding for people that obviously, everyone is tuned to the media and want to know what's going on and trying to understand. And so we're very honored and thankful for our partnership and friendship. We are actually already kind of like starting to work on our upcoming visit, probably in October, November, and very much looking forward, of course, for the opportunity, hopefully, to get together again. We always be more than honored and happy to do that. One more thing, as you said before, we just recently came back from concluding a 10-month, very intensive lecture tour in North America. And people asked me, they were like, people are basically saying, wow, this is crazy, doing 200 events and driving 60,000 kilometers and all those things, and it must be exhausting. And I said, yes, but these meetings with people and providing people with knowledge and being, honored with this stage to hopefully educate, it's very much recharging emotionally and physically and spiritually and so on and so on. So again, we are very thankful for every stage that we are being given. Thank you so much for giving us the stage.
Thank you, Avi. Beautiful. We've recorded today, so if you have friends and family that you'd like to learn from this experience, we'll send it out as soon as we can. Everyone stay safe. Am Yisrael Chai, and may we continue to bring peace. Take care, everybody.
Shalom from Israel.